and welcome. My name is Damir Marusic. I'm the executive editor of the American Interest magazine. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Charles Edel, senior fellow at the United States Centre in Australia. Charlie's a longtime friend of the American Interests and is the co-author with Hal Brands of the excellent book The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order, now in paperback. He's also one of the smartest Asia analysts around. Have a listen. So, Charlie, welcome to the show. Really great to have you here. I understand you just got back from a trip to Japan.
Thanks very much for having me on, Damir. The week before last, I was up in Tokyo for the full week amidst widespread fears of coronavirus breaking out and shutting down the school system. But I was up there, and we actually managed to talk about things other than just coronavirus. The Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs had invited me up on a study trip, with really the idea being for me to do a temperature taking of where the security and political conversation was at, to reacquaint myself with their bureaucracy, having been down in Australia the last couple of years. And it was a really pretty busy week where I was meeting with government officials, policy and political advisors, academics, think tankers, journalists, the whole nine yards, and ended up hearing a wide variety of perspectives on a number of different issues.
I don't want to dwell on coronavirus because for two reasons. I mean, it's been a week since you've been there, and in general, it's such a fast-moving story. It's probably a bit out of date. But do you have a sense, in general, that a feeling within the bureaucracy that they felt good about it, and in general, the civil society you talk to, is there a sense of confidence that the government will be able to do it? And handle it, especially given the Olympics and other things that are looming over the horizon?
Well, look, I'll say when you talk to government officials from any government, you're not going to get anything much other than a feeling of confidence. However, I would say that there were concerns for a rapidly shifting conversation, day by day, hour by hour, not only on how they were handling it, shutting down schools while I was there, seeing if they can move to telecommuting, and of course concerns not only about kind of the changing nature of what the challenge was, whether or not the health system was up to speed, but also, of course, whether or not the Olympics would even be called off as they began to pull down public events. So more questions and concerns than I heard, resolute answers, because, of course, the situation is so fluid at this point.
Right. Well, so can you share a little bit about you've now been you've been in Asia the whole time since Trump came on. What are perceptions like there, especially in Japan, of the last three years and change, about the United States as an ally? Can you give us a sense of what the tenor of that was like?
Absolutely. Although, if you don't mind, I'll go even broader about more than just the U.S., Damir, because the conversation was fascinating. And as I said, last time I was up in Tokyo was about 2 years ago, and that's an eternity. So things really have evolved. But I would say kind of four or five factors were most striking to me, and only some of them had to deal with the U.S. So I thought, and happy to drill down on any of these as we proceed here. But there was a consensus across the board in government and outside of government that Japan really had entered a new and perhaps even unique security environment, and a consensus by everyone that it wasn't a favorable one. And that's even a degradation over the last 2 to 3 years. Second point, it was told to me over and over again that if you look at Abe over his tenure this time around, if you look at it as compared with the first time that he was prime minister, that there really was a consistency to Japan's approach, but also an evolution in how it went about trying to produce security in the region. With regards to China, there was really a variety of attitudes about the current trajectory of Japanese-Chinese relations. Most people would say that they were on a warming trajectory. There was supposed to be a state visit. In fact, in the very hotel I was staying at, the Chinese state counselor was over trying to arrange the visit to Tokyo of Xi Jinping. That's temporarily been called off because of coronavirus. But there are large trends in a warming relationship between the two of them. But there were, both in and outside of government, a variety of takes on why that was happening and whether or not that was useful in the way that it was evolving. Fourth, to your point, Damir, on the U.S., I would say there were, a wide variety, a multiplicity of thoughts, a stress on the importance of the U.S. and the U.S.-Japan alliance, fears about the U.S., both about Trump and about kind of long-term trajectory of the U.S. in the region, and perhaps most troubling from their perspective, a lack of clarity on where the U.S. Was going. And then you couple those all together, and what I thought was really interesting were the questions that were raised, sometimes by my interlocutor, sometimes by me, about the future direction of Japanese defense policy and more broadly about their strategic orientation.
Yeah, I mean, just as you're speaking there, I'm taking notes, and it's striking. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, uh, well, the intersection of some of these, like the intersection of a deteriorating security environment on the one hand, and this outreach by China. Clearly, the Chinese see the exact same environment and are reaching out. As you said, you said your interlocutors are trying to sort of see what uh, the likely why it's happening and whether it's useful. How are those two things interacting basically?
In terms of their security environment, and this I think was made clear to me over and over again, that while China frames a large part of the conversation, it's not the only thing that's driving heightened concerns about a deteriorating external security environment. And the various people that I spoke with pointed to a number of different factors. About things that they would mark as that's new. This hasn't really existed before. It's new that in the past, the U.S. Japan alliance had pretty set roles. Japan was supposed to do self defense, it was the shield, and the U.S. was the security umbrella. It was the sword more than anything else. And the conversation really began to evolve to there's a growing conversation in Japan about whether or not that relationship is changing, whether or not it needs to evolve, and how Japan ought to think about more autonomous, even a more independent foreign policy. Um, that when you get down in the weeds a little bit about what that means, the most interesting security conversation was about whether or not Japan needs to begin investing in more strike capabilities, missiles that have offensive as well as simply defensive capabilities. I would say there's more talk about whether or not there should be talk about that than there is development, but there are a variety of different avenues that they could pursue if they chose to. Co-development with the U.S., indigenous production on their own, just more assets of the U.S. in there. But this is a new type of conversation than they have had in the past. Kind of part and parcel of that is in the past, entrapment has really been the key conversation for Japan when it talks about its security relationship with the U.S. Always fearful of its alliance with the U.S. potentially trapping them into a U.S.-led adventure or misadventure. That was clear during the Vietnam War and clear during the Gulf Wars and clear now potentially, or had been, about its relationship with China. What's changing, though, is as the security environment shifts, as China grows more powerful, as questions about the U.S. staying power loom larger, rightly or wrongly, that fear seems to have moved away from entrapment and more towards abandonment. Now they're more concerned about, if not being abandoned by the U.S., no one thinks they're going to be abandoned by the U.S. If they have to do more themselves, what does that mean for them? The other thing I would just note here is, when you talk kind of about the long sweep of Japanese history, even post Meiji Revolution, right? Japan is the first nation to modernize itself in Asia, and something that's always taken pride in being on the forefront of technological innovation. As they gazed at their big neighbors, to the West, to China, it's very clear that they're no longer moving at the forefront of technological innovation. And that is a very different situation than they have been in before. So all of those, I think, add up to that the security environment is less stable and deteriorating maybe more rapidly than they had even thought 2 to 3 years ago. Now, security and defense politics are always fraught political topics in Japan. And you can hear that there's consternation and even argument about whether or not the public is on board for this changing security environment. As was said to me in almost every conversation I had, Kim Jong un and Xi Jinping seem to have inured the public to the need for this stuff more than they have in the past. But as to what this means, what type of capabilities that Japan needs, that's still a conversation that's largely confined to government about what they need to do about it. Now, you had asked about what does that mean for a warming relationship with China? There's no single view on this. It's important to stress. There are warming relations between the two countries. But I heard a variety and even a variety of contradictory things that were said, that there needed to be more balance, not just a hard edge policy. You need to have a cooperative policy as well, that we needed to have an inclusive vision for Asia, which means including China as well. And that we need to have a more favorable atmosphere where we can pursue economic projects and not just balance and brace against each other economically. The critique of that is not just trying to counter them, but maybe we've leaned too far on the economic engagement and we've gone quieter on some of our security concerns. So the most favorable view of this, Damir, is that the Japanese government knows exactly what it's doing. It's hugging China harder while it continues to slug them or at least push against them. That won't ever change because of where Japan lives. But there have been a variety of perspectives on whether or not they've shifted too quickly towards engagement and whether or not that serves their interests. And then the biggest takeaway, I think, here is this engagement, this figuring out how they can work better with China in the region, which is, of course, something that they had heard from all the nations of Southeast Asia, that they wouldn't take a zero-sum approach, that they needed Japan to engage with and set a model for how to engage better with China. All of that is predicated, or at least had been predicated, on warming U.S.-China relations. And when you have U.S.-China relations moving in the opposite direction of that, it adds a very large question mark about the trajectory of Japanese-Chinese relations as well.
Lots to work with there. I guess one of the questions then is this perception in Japan of that the security environment is changing for all these reasons. As you said, it has a lot to do with the Trump administration, but not solely. It's longer than that, right? So the question then is, I guess at the time while you were there, Super Tuesday hadn't happened yet. So there was this question that perhaps even Bernie Sanders would be the other side of it. Did that? I guess my question is, are they looking so big picture and they've abstracted the United States as just increasingly unreliable that maybe the ascent of a more centrist alternative like Biden doesn't even move the needle for them? Or are they following closely enough? And how important is this election to observers, to strategists in Asia right now?
Well, I think that this is an enormously consequential election to thinkers, to policy analysts, and to strategists in Asia, in Japan, no less, here in Australia, where I live. But there's a variety of different things to think about. So, one, just to back up, while the Japanese official view, of course, is that their relationship with the U.S. has never been stronger, and indeed, even unofficially, you'd hear a lot of balanced view of the Trump administration. So not all bad, right? That the more assertive stance on blaming China for its predatory statecraft, for its civil military fusion, calling China out by name has been helpful. But of course, you would hear in the same breath concerns about the deeply transactional take of the Trump administration and concerns that while the U.S. has certainly taken a harder line, it has also demonstrated a lack of nuance, a lack of attention to Southeast Asia, a lack of an economic component to its strategy, and a lack of attention to traditional allies. And for all those reasons, it is not self-sustaining. So again, almost everyone I talked to said the Japan-U.S. relationship is just fine, but we are also concerned about the broader take of the U.S. in Asia, which is not quite as fine as we would like it to be. So that's kind of step one. In terms of this election, yes, I got a ton of questions, as you might expect, about one, who is going to win the election? And I said anyone's guess.
Right.
This was before Super Tuesday, and you can even say that the question marks remain now. But three, the larger questions about longer term trajectory of the United States. And I would note two things on this conversation, Damir. First is there is not going to be a change in Japanese priorities. Building, deepening, strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance is priority number one. It's probably priority number 2 and 3 as well. 4, 5, and 6, the steps that they've taken under Abe, meaning outreach to Southeast Asia, outreach to other like-mindeds, both Australia and India, having an economic component, having an inclusive approach, which means China as well. Those are the other elements of this, along with respect for and an embrace of multilateral institutions, no less principles. That's not going to change, and the U.S. Sits kind of at the top of the priority list. I think there's recognition that, like Trump or dislike Trump, and my hosts were all very polite, so they didn't say one way or the other, that there is a recognition that the alliance has to evolve, and it simply has to evolve because the security environment has degraded, the balance of power has shifted, and the economic balances or imbalances mean that the United States can't do this alone to the extent that it has in the past. I think the message has gotten through loud and clear. That's not just Trump, but Obama before him and Bush before him, saying that allies have to do more. Now, there's some concern, as you might expect, saying we recognize this, but be careful how hard you push us. Some of that's, of course, some good messaging for American friends. But right now, Tokyo spends approximately not quite 0.9% of its GDP for defense-related matters. That's insufficient. But when we talk about NATO allies spending 2%, I was told that's a non-starter. We're talking about maybe slight slow shifts towards 1.2% or so. But that's just spending. And it's also questions of where they need to be, who they need to be doing things with. And to me, the largest questions that loomed was not that the strategic options aren't headed in the right direction and the strategic orientation is incorrect. They are, and they certainly thought they were. The question is pace. Are they moving fast enough, given the trajectories within the region? Second point, I'm getting nice and long-winded here for you, Damir, is, you asked the question about Sanders and, concerns about what a less deeply engaged America would be. And it was a very interesting series of conversations on that respect, because one, I think I would point out to our friends that, we don't know exactly what Sanders' foreign policy would be if he were to be the Democratic nominee, no less the U.S. president, because it's a work in progress during campaigns. And even the more troubling aspects from a Japanese perspective, like statements by his foreign policy advisor that the long-term sustainability of U.S. troop deployments in Japan and the Korean Peninsula might not be sustainable, right? That sets off like fireworks in the head of every Japanese strategist.
Right.
Need to be balanced against, Bernie Sanders himself making the case that we increasingly see the world divided between democratic and authoritarian states, and we need to put, a la Elizabeth Warren, anti-corruption at the heart of U.S. domestic, no less international efforts, which are actually a very assertive set of policies.
Yeah.
The point I made, at least to our interlocutors, were things were a work in progress. And even though Trump's election had sent shockwaves through the Japanese foreign policy establishment, they found a way very quickly to work with him. They were the first allies to meet with him. The relationship has clearly not given Tokyo everything that they wanted, and sometimes comes, at their expense. But they did find a way to work with them, and that's a pretty well working set of alliance-based relationships. And no matter who was elected, they would figure out a way to work with the U.S. as well.
Well, so what would your advice be? Assume a new administration is coming in. Let's not belabor the question of who is whether it's a different Republican or whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden at this point. What would be your advice for the Japan person? How to best what are the sort of key traction points where the United States could most effectively show a kind of change to both for U.S. interests and for the sort of the strength of the alliance to sort of settle the situation over there. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, although settle the situation might be too much to hope for, because there's so much that's unsettled both within Tokyo, the U.S., and around the region.
Right.
But what I would say is that there, in some senses, if you have a Democratic administration running to open arms, at least on the surface level of things, because one of the consistent critiques by all the Democrats who are running for office, and in fact echoed throughout Asia, I would say as well, sometimes in greater, sometimes in quieter voice, is that while the harder-edged version of the U.S. approach to China has had its utility and has had its benefits, it's insufficient. And it's insufficient both to build a coalition, and it's insufficient to even understand what the end state is. And so therefore, you could see any Democratic administration wanting to do the opposite of what Trump has done in terms of paying more attention to alliances, first and foremost. Second, paying more attention to institutions and multilateral initiatives. That does not mean that the United States would rejoin CPTPP on day one of a Democratic administration, but it would be more open to that. Point three, much more attention to Southeast Asia, as opposed to just China and Japan and occasionally Australia. Point four, and these are all things I think Japan would want to stress that a new Democratic administration would be very open to. Some points on the more forward-leaning security initiatives and moves, negative points on the economic policy to date. So let's develop one immediately. That goes in line with, there are things that Japan and the US and Australia have done together. There's certainly been a lot of announcements that they have made. The values line up, the principles line up, but thus far, almost everyone has pointed to a lack of real projects, real things on the ground that you can point to. People keep pointing to the one initiative that seems to have gone off the ground is a trilateral effort to help electrify Papua New Guinea. But we're still waiting on that to happen, and that seems to be the only real project. So a laundry list that they could come to with the U.S. of here's where we want to start moving, here's where we need your help. And then I think really concretely, too, in addition to all of that, instead of the United States browbeating our ally on them paying more to host our forces, I think that there's real grounds for an argument to be made that says, look, we're actually going to take that money and put it into our own defense. We're going to begin to be a larger contributor. And in some ways, that should be easy for them, because Abe's had such an ambitious foreign policy we actually have to see the resources now begin to match up to that more than it has in the past. So there's a number of things that Japan could do and do very quickly to work with the US to demonstrate a fuller and more comprehensive approach in Asia.
You were at State Department during the Obama administration.
Yep, I served in the Office of Policy Planning for the final 2 years of the Obama administration.
And what kind of headwinds, sort of in the policy process, were there? And do you think that those will have sort of cleared up now with the both the if a Democrat were to come in, would there be a different sort of clarity of purpose? Because the much discussed pivot to Asia also had many shortcomings. Do you think a lot of the roadblocks to so this outline that you just sketched won't be present this time around?
No, I think, and this is where I think the Trump administration, more so than Trump himself, has made greatest strides. That there's a recognition that there is a competitive environment, that working with China as the first and foremost take on what the US is doing has shifted. That's not, of course, where the Obama administration was, but I think the efforts to re energize an alliance based policy, making sure that Asia policy comes first, China policy comes second, or I should rather say that China is part of Asia policy and not the other way around. I think the ability to roll out a much more fully developed and tougher set of strategies, which you've seen not only stemming from defense and state, but already coming from commerce and justice as well. I actually think that the Trump administration has shifted this, and I don't think it's going to shift back. The question is now whether or not we can come up with a more comprehensive set of policies that also bring allies on board for this as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Charlie. It's been great. Glad you had a great trip. Thanks for taking the time.
Look, I got to eat a lot of sushi while I was there. How could it be bad?
Excellent. Take care, Charlie.